This video is sponsored by Conflict of Nations, the free online strategy game where you'll bring the most modern technology to the battlefield. Take control of a real country to find out what it's like to lead it in a modern global warfare in real-time games that can take weeks to complete. As you field armies filled with over 100 beautifully modeled modern weapon systems, there's everything from combat attack helicopters and airborne infantry units to stealth fighters and even nuclear ballistic submarines. And it's not just the models that are realistic. I absolutely love how they move across the map at a realistic speed, something that can take hours, giving me time to think about my tactics and create deep strategic plans. Infographics show viewers get a special gift of 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free when they use the link, but it's only available for 30 days, so click the link, choose a country, and start fighting your way to victory right now. War has broken out on a remote corner of the world. U.S. forces rush to respond, but the U.S. Navy's aircraft carriers, the tip of the spear of the American military might, will take at least a week to get on station. Allied forces are in desperate need of air support now. Modern military aircraft can end a war in days versus an unprepared foe. From bases in the U.S. and Germany, massive Boeing 747s lift off one by one. These are some of the largest planes ever built, specially modified 747s developed for the U.S. Air Force with an airlift capacity of a whopping 454 tons. These massive planes wheel in the sky, turning their noses toward their final destination, the skies over what could turn into World War III if the United States can't stop the conflict before it spirals out of control. As 10 of the lumbering jets approach hostile skies, enemy long-range radar easily picks them up, and fighters are dispatched to intercept. The massive planes are slow, relatively speaking, and are easy prey for incoming fighters. The enemy pilots can't believe their luck. The mighty U.S. Air Force is basically serving up fat, juicy targets on a platter for them. Suddenly, a cargo bay door opens on the front of the plane. A small fighter jet, approximately 3/4 the size of an F-16, is pushed out on a conveyor belt. The plane plummets straight down as its engines flare to life, and the pilot eases the stick back to level out. A little over a minute later, a second plane is pushed out of the American 747. In 15 minutes, the 10 747s have disgorged their entire complement of 10 fighter aircraft each. The enemy is suddenly facing a flight of 100 American fighters. Small, nimble, and not as heavily armed as traditional fighter jets, these small fighters are nonetheless a lethal force. Not only do they have superior numbers on their side, but their small sizes and stealth features make them incredibly difficult to accurately target at long range. And with enough weapons and fuel on board their mothership to last for days, they can stay on station for nearly a week, giving traditional U.S. forces more than enough time to arrive. The concept might sound like something straight out of science fiction or an Avengers movie, but the airborne carrier concept has actually been something seriously considered by U.S. military planners for 5 decades now. However, this is nothing new, and the legacy of the airborne aircraft carrier dates back to practically the dawn of flight itself. Within years of the first successful flight at Kitty Hawk, militaries around the world are already pressing airplanes into service. While balloons had been in widespread use for years as excellent surveillance platforms, they were slow, unreliable, and easily destroyed. Zeppelins solved many of these problems but faced a host of their own issues, including the fact that as anti-air artillery improved, they became a massive liability. Airplanes, however, were fast and agile and could cover great distances. They were the perfect scouting tool. But aircraft were inherently limited in their range, and getting them quickly to where they were needed most was difficult. They required extensive ground-based support, including a functional airfield close to the front and safe supply lines to transport volatile gasoline and other materials needed to keep them in flight. An airborne aircraft carrier would solve all the problems. It could bring its own supplies with it anywhere it went, and it could outpace even the fastest naval aircraft carriers. Even more importantly, they could go where a Navy ship couldn't go, inland. Various nations toyed around with the idea of launching aircraft from dirigibles, including the United States and Great Britain. The U.S. even modified 2 dirigibles to carry, launch, and recover aircraft. The launching was relatively simple. Each plane would be dropped from the belly of the ship, falling until it gained enough airspeed to generate lift. A wild ride for sure, but a relatively safe one. Recovering aircraft, however, was something else entirely. First, there was no way to build an actual runway on top of a dirigible. Though the idea was brainstormed, instead, the best way to recover aircraft was through a mechanism that would hook the aircraft and reel it up, sort of like a trapeze. This required a pilot with nerves of steel, who would have to slow his plane down to match the speed of the much slower dirigible. This risked stalling the plane out, which would cause it to lose lift and crash. And to add to the difficulty, the parasitic fighters were purposefully built built, small, and lightweight, and in any amount of turbulence, they'd be thrown around dramatically. Despite these challenges, American airships Akron and Macon both proved that the flying aircraft carrier using a dirigible was actually feasible. Both ships conducted several successful launches and recoveries of their parasitic fighters, and the concept was gaining traction in the 1930s. However, dirigibles were notoriously finicky aircraft, and a number of very high-profile accidents, including the total loss of the Akron, led the U.S. Navy to focus its efforts elsewhere. However, the airborne aircraft carrier concept had worked. The idea would once more find fertile ground in the minds of war planners during World War II, especially in the first half of the war. Allied bombers flying deep into Germany were getting routinely mauled by fighters, and the Luftwaffe knew that Allied fighters could only provide air cover for about half the journey. Therefore, they simply waited well outside of the Allied fighters' range, ready to pounce on the big bombers as soon as their escorts were forced to turn back. It was a slaughter, and for a while, air crews had the shortest life expectancy of any job in the Allied military. In the Pacific, the dream of airborne carriers would allow the U.S. forces to strike hard and deep into Japanese territory, completely outmaneuvering Japan's surface naval forces. However, there were other priorities for already tight military budgets, and despite the promising tests of the concept in the 1930s, the idea was shelved. The concept would be resurrected in some form or another for the next few decades, though no significant progress was made. In the mid to late 60s, though, many of those World War II veterans who had dreamt of flying aircraft carriers once more resurrected the idea. Again, the idea was pitched out of sheer necessity. America's massive fleet of strategic bombers had the range to hit any Soviet target from bases in the U.S., but America's fighters could never keep up with the big bombers. If conventional or nuclear war were to break out, the B-52s would be basically on their own as they crossed the Arctic Circle and into hostile airspace. But what if defending aircraft could be carried into battle alongside them? One idea proposed attaching a fighter or two to each bomber aircraft, in essence allowing each aircraft to carry their own fighter escort with them and launch when necessary. However, the complicated equipment needed for recovery was nearly impossible to fit onto a bomber without serious modifications that would jeopardize its primary mission of dropping bombs. Fighter escorts would basically be forced to fend for themselves once they were detached, and believe it or not, the idea was briefly considered for the all-important nuclear bomber fleet. The pilot's sacrifice was acceptable to many military planners that needed to ensure nukes landed on Soviet targets as needed. The more realistic solution, though, involved a single aircraft specially modified to carry parasitic fighters internally. The fighters would be smaller than a traditional fighter aircraft, as they wouldn't need as large a fuel load. Their small size would also limit their payloads, but with the planes dedicated solely to air superiority, they'd be able to pack enough of a punch to threaten enemy fighters. Such an aircraft had already been designed and flown back in World War II, and the years immediately after, the most famous of being the XF-85 Goblin. This tiny fighter would have indeed been a terror in the sky, as its incredibly small size gave it great maneuverability and speed, and made it a frustratingly small target for enemy fighters. The new airborne aircraft carrier would be based around a modified Boeing 747. This allowed the parasitic fighters to be slightly larger than the Goblin and thus carry more fuel and weapons. The fighters would be stowed internally on an upper flight deck, and a conveyor belt system would move them onto an elevator, which would lower them to the lower flight deck, where another conveyor would once more push them toward the front of the aircraft. Once there, a ramp door would open and the fighter would simply be pushed out. With a deployment time of about 80 seconds, the 747's entire complement of 10 fighters could be airborne in just about 15 minutes. Once it was time to recover the aircraft, another ramp door would open in the rear. Then a hook would be extended and the incoming fighter would hook itself, very similar to how aircraft conduct modern aerial refueling operations. Then the parasitic fighter would be reeled in, placed on a conveyor belt, and moved inside. Each 747 could carry enough fuel and weapons for multiple sorties each, and airborne refueling planes could keep the mothership in the air for days at a time if needed. The only limitation was the physical endurance of the mothership's engines. While not on a mission, the crew of the parasitic fighters could relax in their own cabins, with a full galley able to cook hot meals on demand. In the 70s, the technology was there, and the launch and retrieval systems had already been proven multiple times in the past. So, why didn't airborne aircraft carriers happen? First, aircraft designers would have to make a decision on what to prioritize with the parasitic fighters themselves. Should they prioritize weapons capability, fuel storage, or radar? A small aircraft means sacrifices would have to be made, as the technology had not yet miniaturized components enough to make microfighters that could enjoy adequate amounts of focus on all three areas. The threat had also changed. While in the 40s and 50s, most air-to-air battles were still carried out with guns, by the 70s, heat-seeking and radar-guided missiles were the preferred weapon. Soviet fighters had both good long-range missiles and powerful radars, and while in the past its tiny size would have made it a difficult target to hit with guns, now the microfighter's small size was a liability that limited its ability to carry adequate long-range radar equipment. In a face-off against Soviet fighters, the microfighters would have been swatted out of the sky like gnats. But big planes were becoming increasingly vulnerable themselves, and the primary threat was no longer the fighter but rather the anti-air missile. These telephone pole-sized missiles could be shot from dozens, even hundreds of miles away, and a single one could take out a bomber. Microfighters wouldn't just be useless in this scenario, but the airborne carrier itself would be a massive liability, with the loss of 10 fighter pilots and the entire airborne carrier's crew if one was shot down. The price was simply too high. However, today the concept has once more gained some resurgence, but this time the US isn't looking at launching microfighters, or at least not traditional microfighters. Today, the United States is testing a weapons program it calls Gremlins. The concept is simple: a C-130 Hercules aircraft outfitted with an entire fleet of small, remotely controlled or automated drones. Each drone would have a different job. Some would be dedicated to air superiority, taking on enemy fighters directly, others would be for scouting or reconnaissance, while others yet would be used to spoof or jam enemy radars and communications. Some would even be launched in suicide attacks against ground targets. With each C-130 capable of carrying dozens of drones, the concept of the airborne carrier is finally taking a step out of fiction and into reality. But how close is this to actually being reality? Well, a lot closer than you might think, as the program has successfully deployed and recovered drones while in flight. Details are still scarce, as the US is keeping a very tight lid on what might be truly a game-changing way of waging future air war. But the writing is on the wall. In a future conflict, it may no longer be the US Navy who's the tip of the American military spear, but specially designed US Air Force motherships traveling anywhere in the world within hours, and disgorging hundreds of combat drones against enemy air, sea, and land forces. Thanks again to our sponsor, Conflict of Nations, the free online PvP strategy game set in a modern global warfare. Get a special gift of 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free by using the link. It's only available for 30 days, so don't wait. Download Conflict of Nations and start fighting your way to victory right now. Go check out These Are the Weapons America's Enemies Fear Most, or click this other video instead.